Hello, this is Pro Life Indeed, and I was hoping to talk to you today something about, not specifically about abortion, but that's alright because being pro life is, all encompassing. It's about all kind of human life. So I was hoping to talk to you today about sunlight, actually, because that's one aspect of public health that I think is getting more attention than it used to, but still not quite enough, in my opinion. Um, but first, I want to talk about a piece from the Sunlight Institute, sunlightinstitute.org, that I found quite interesting. The title of it is called Sun Exposure, the Key to a Normal, Healthy Pregnancy. Um, and it talks about how sun exposure controls vitamin D levels. And there was a study recently done that it's reviewing here, summarizing, talking about pregnant Arab women. And obviously, Saudi Arabia has a lot of sunlight because it's pretty close to the equator, but most of the women there are wearing a lot of clothing, covering up basically the whole body to make sure they're following their standards of modesty for religious and cultural reasons. Um, but modesty, while appreciated, can also have the disadvantage of covering up too much of the skin and then not letting them get the sufficient sunlight exposure they need in order to be healthy, especially during pregnancy. There have also been studies done for all-cause mortality, and I encourage people to read into those. But basically, people who avoid sunlight tend to have a much higher all-cause mortality. They're more likely to die, especially from things like cardiovascular mortality. Basically, people who stay cooped up inside all day, they're not getting outside to get physical activity, sunlight, and there's one theory that's so I think this they call it the old friends theory. Basically, the idea that being outside is good for you, not just because of sunlight and exercise, but also because you're getting exposed to bacteria, viruses, things that are actually important for humans to be exposed to. Even though they can cause diseases, regular, consistent exposure to those things is believed to be helpful. So, getting outside is believed to be healthy for you for a variety of reasons. But sun exposure in particular is what I'm hoping to talk about here, because sunlight deficiency has actually been linked to various diseases, especially in pregnant women. Gestational diabetes, anemia, iron deficiency, and eclampsia. If I can pronounce that, eclampsia, I think. Um, but basically, the vitamin D is vital for the body's chemistry, which helps with absorption of various things being consumed. So calcium and iron, for example, the body can ingest those things, but it can't necessarily absorb those without the proper chemical ingredients inside of the body. So in order to actually absorb calcium and iron, calcium being very important to osteoporosis, in order to actually absorb the nutrients needed to support bone health and then, of course, the health of a growing person inside the womb, in order to support those things, you need to make sure you get sunlight exposure to ensure that the body is actually making proper use of its chemistry and its potential to manufacture things within the body. So it's an interesting and neglected, I think, component of science, and of just public health in general. It's like people don't tend to get outside enough. And of course, we're getting more and more temptation to be inside all the time. We have air conditioning, we have television, we have, well, a lot of things that you can primarily do inside, but you don't really have set up to do outside. So unfortunately, as technology increases, it might get harder and harder to encourage people to get outside and get physical activity. I like to think dogs are a good protective measure against this because dogs love getting outside, they love running around, they love going and smelling things outside. So I like to think dogs are useful for this. But yeah, people need to, I think they need to get read up on this. They need to check into these things because it's important for all-cause mortality for everyone, and then it's also important for making sure that the child in the womb is developing properly. So this is one where I feel it's a neglected area of science, and I think it's important for people to look into it. But from what I've read on it, it looks like about a 10% decrease in all-cause mortality for typical adults. So, as in getting outside for a couple hours a day can cut your chances of dying in a particular year by about 10%. So it's pretty significant. I'd say that matters quite a bit. And of course, all-cause mortality has a lot of different things going into it, smoking and exercise. And of course, your odds of exercising are higher if you're getting outside a lot. People who get outside tend to get more physical activity because they're in a big open space where they can run around and such. They're like a lot of people like going on walks outside. They're not just gonna walk in circles inside or in a gymnasium or something like that. It's a lot more interesting to walk around outside. So, in a certain sense, you can't divorce sunlight from exercise. Like they're important things together. Um, and exercise is another component of proper absorption of vitamin D from the diet. So even if you're eating foods that have vitamin D in it, without exercise, if you're living a very sedentary lifestyle, you might not actually absorb those nutrients. It's one where there are a lot of different components to it, but reading up on it, you realize the significance and importance of sunlight, of getting exercise, and also proper fortification of foods. That's one where it's like I'm not super excited about kind of modifying foods, but I can recognize when people aren't eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, if you can fortify the foods that people are eating, cereals and butter and milk and stuff like that. If you fortify those things, even though people aren't eating a ton, um, even though people aren't eating a ton of like naturally occurring foods like fruits and vegetables, um, they're still getting those kinds of nutrients because you're basically taking some of the necessary chemical components from fruits and vegetables and putting them into things that people are actually eating. So you can kind of work around people's bad decisions a bit by fortification of foods. And that's one where it is kind of a government run measure, so I'm not super excited about it because it's kind of feels kind of top down. But at the same time, I can recognize it might have a practical utility. It might just end up working, even if the means by which it comes about aren't necessarily preferable. Um, but I suppose a lot of foods have all the packaging fortified with this and that, and I think that generally does tend to make something sell a little better if you say it's fortified with vitamin C or whatever. When you tell people that, I think it slightly increases people's chances of buying it. So I suppose that implies a general consent from the public based on the fact that people are more likely to buy something that says that it's fortified with whatever vitamins and minerals and such. But yeah, sunlight is interesting to me because it is it's mostly free. You have like the time lost, I suppose, and whatever, if you wanted to watch television or something inside, I suppose you're losing out on indoor time if you're spending time outside. But there are certain things you can do outside that are just as good as whatever you'd be doing inside. Like if you want to read a book, for example, like, okay, being outside is great for you, right? Because you get that sunlight exposure while reading. Spend less money on electricity too, because you don't need artificial lights to see the pages. You can use sunlight to see the pages. But television and video games, those are things that those are tricky because those things capture people's attention really well, but it also encourages people to just live indoors all the time and never get outside, never get in anything close to nature. So it can be tricky, and we're going to see those kind of challenges where people are more tempted to spend all their time indoors because of the internet, because of television, because of video games. But as time goes on, I think hopefully there will be kind of a reaction to these trends where people can kind of see, well, okay, yeah, and they can like see the data, the research, and say, okay, well, yeah, based on what I'm reading here, I guess I'd better go outside for a little bit, take the dogs on a walk or something like that. Go play some kind of game outside, or just read a book outdoors. And television, that's one where feasibly you could get a television set up outside, but it seems to require a bit more work. And like, how do you prevent the television from getting rained on? Do you have to like set up the television outside in order to make it happen? So I don't know. I suppose skylights could be one solution to that, where you have basically slits in the ceiling or in the roof, where you have glass that will allow a certain portion of the sunlight through. Granted, I think a lot of skylights nowadays have basically ultraviolet filtering on them, so they're not going to let in too much ultraviolet light, but they're probably going to let in a little bit at least. So that'd be, I suppose, a step in the right direction if you can use natural lighting for rooms, or if you have windows, if you can keep the windows open and actually let in some light, that would be preferable too. Another good thing to do. Yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I think it is really interesting and important stuff here, and for the most part, like, it doesn't cost you much to actually get sunlight exposure and to be, kind of taking control of your health a little bit, doing things that appear to be useful. But yeah, sunlight, diet, and exercise, they appear to be all three of those things appear to be really important for basically the all-cause mortality, and also for making sure you're taking proper care of the children in the womb. Um, but yeah, that's one where you see kind of special challenges in certain regions of the world where their rules of modesty prevent women from getting vital sunlight. So that can be a bit tricky, but um, yeah, that's one where you kind of have to work around it. And, perhaps the way they can do it in areas where they have very strict rules of modesty is basically to have um, cordoned off areas or restricted areas for women only, where they can show slightly more of their bodies, like their face, their arms, and everything, um, without technically breaking the rules of modesty associated with, like, if men were to see them when they're not wearing the full body covering, as compared to women. Like, maybe it's permissible under certain definitions of, like, their rules of modesty. Perhaps it's okay in certain areas if you have like a walled off area, so men can't see in, but women can expose parts of their bodies and get some very useful sunlight, so that they're actually getting the proper vitamin D levels. But yeah, looking into Middle Eastern women and their vitamin D levels, it's pretty bad stuff, because it appears that only a small minority of women in the Middle East are getting proper sunlight exposure. Um, so that's one where you have to be a bit cautious about that, because you're working with, like, even if they're outside a lot, they're still having so much of their bodies covered that it might not be good enough, you know. So that's one where it's a tricky sort of thing to work through. But I think the more people read up on it, I think the more they're going to tend to make better decisions. So hopefully that's something that we can see improvements on, as you know, kind of the public opinion kind of changes a little bit on sunlight, because for a long time people thought with sunlight, oh well, you want to stay inside, or if you do go outside, you want to get completely covered in sunscreen to make sure you don't get burned. Like, that's kind of what people's perceptions have been on it in the past. But I think it is actually really important for people to get good sunlight exposure, and hopefully people will have a bit more nuance to it when they recognize that while you want to avoid getting burned by the sun, you also want to make sure you're getting sunlight exposure to make sure that your body can produce the vital chemicals. And of course, there have been certain diseases people have known about for a long time, where sunlight just directly cures a disease. Rickets, for example. Rickets are, like, directly cured by getting sunlight. So it's kind of amusing that there's a disease that it's not just helpful, it's like a direct cure to get sunlight exposure. And that is a major component of osteoporosis and bone health in general, is getting sunlight exposure. Because you can ingest iron and calcium, but your body might not actually make use of those things, might not actually absorb them, unless you're having the proper bodily chemistry as modified by sunlight. So it's interesting to think about, and hopefully as time goes on, we'll figure out new ways of making sure we can get the ultraviolet light we need, even when we have more temptations to stay inside. Oh, and one last thing, solarium use. Basically, artificial tanning beds. Those sorts of things actually are linked with lower rates of all-cause mortality, meaning people who use solariums, tanning beds, are actually less likely to die in a particular year. They're more likely to survive longer, based on the fact that they're using tanning beds, things that are giving them ultraviolet light exposure without actually having to go outside. And I'd imagine when you get into, like, the really far northern regions of the world, if you were living in, like, Alaska, Siberia, Canada, I'd imagine in those areas it's actually really important to have solariums, because even if you try to go outside and tan, I mean, first of all, there's the cold environment that'll encourage you to wear a ton of clothing, you know. I mean, I'd imagine a typical, like, Siberian is wearing more clothing than a typical Muslim, you know, even with the very strict standards of modesty. Like, they still might have more exposed than someone who's living in a completely frigid region of the world. But, you know, perhaps as time goes on, you know, we'll see these areas of the world like Alaska, Canada, Russia, perhaps they're going to get more solariums installed, and perhaps even with, like, the public health aspect of it, maybe there will even be pushes for, like, I don't know if you want to call them parks, but government institutions, to have, like, publicly available solariums to try to get them sunlight exposure, because it's too cold to have, like, have a majority of your body exposed to sunlight in Siberia, and then it's also, at the same time as being too cold, it's also just not that intense of sunlight compared to, like, living near the equator. You know, the equator has a lot of intense sunlight, but if you're living near the North Pole, like, there's just not enough not enough intensity really to match what the human body requires. And obviously, skin pigmentation goes into that a lot. If you have someone moving from like Kenya to Siberia, okay, that's going to create some challenges because Kenyans are, they are made they are made to live in Kenya. Their bodily pigmentation matches the environment they're in. So that's one where you would see probably increased challenges having people with dark skin tones moving to basically polar regions of the world, just like you would see challenges with someone from a northern region of the world moving south, moving to an equatorial region. They're probably going to get sunburned a lot at first, and over time you can see people with fair skins, getting their skin darkened a bit. So there is a certain level of adaptation that people with fair skin can do, but typically with fair skin you can only get so dark. You're not gonna be able to match like an Ethiopian or something like that. I mean, you might be able to match, like an Arab level of sunlight. Obviously, there are some fair skinned people who end up getting quite dark because they use a lot of tanning beds. I once worked with a guy who had like icy blue eyes, like very shockingly blue, but his skin was very dark. Like you might think from his pigmentation, he might actually be living in Mexico or something. He had very dark skin because he used a tanning bed for most of his life. I think he actually like owned like I don't know if he owned a tanning bed or like a place for people to come to use tanning beds for a time, and then he also just got outside a ton. So he was one guy where even though his eyes were icy blue, like like Sweden blue, he had really dark skin, like he was like Italian or like Arabic or something. So it's kind of amusing. Sometimes you can see those kind of modifications, and you can get pushed pretty far. The body can adapt considerably to different environments. But yeah, generally speaking, people from equatorial regions with really dark skin tones moving north, they're gonna have trouble because they can't just get rid of all that melanin. You can add melanin, but there's difficulty in removing melanin. So yeah, we'll see those challenges, I suppose. With immigration and stuff, north and south, people having to adapt to new environments, and then as technology changes, hopefully solariums will help people, catch up, catch up with the temptation to be inside all the time, watching television, playing video games. Hopefully people will start using solariums a bit more if they're not actually going to go and get outside. I think it's useful to get outside to get physical activity, but obviously sunlight and ultraviolet light exposure, those things are important too. It's not just about getting exercise. There's more to it than that. But yeah, this is one where it's a bit outside of what I would normally talk about. I mean, I would normally talk about the abortion issue, but being pro-life requires taking care of human life at all stages, not just the earliest stages. Even though the early stages are very important for the health going forward, it's useful to talk about things that we can do as adults to try to take care of ourselves and try to live longer, healthier lives. So thank you so much for sticking with me this long. I really appreciate it. This has been Pro-Life Indeed.